Imagine being Kevin Durant. You are one of the greatest scorers in the history of professional basketball. You have 2 NBA championships, 2 Finals MVP awards, and a resume that puts you in conversations with the all-time legends of this sport. You have been through wars in Oklahoma City, drama in Golden State, rebuilding in Brooklyn, and a fresh start in Phoenix. And now, here you are in Houston, Texas, supposed to be the missing piece, the final puzzle that transforms a young, hungry Rockets team into a genuine championship contender. The lights are on, the moment is yours. And then, in the closing seconds of a game that your team desperately needs to win, the ball is not in your hands. The play is not drawn up for you. Instead, your coach is looking you dead in the eye and telling you to pass it to someone else. And that someone else is about to walk up to the free throw line and decide the entire night with 2 pressure free throws. The crowd is silent. The building is holding its breath. And somewhere deep inside Kevin Durant, something is snapping. What you are about to see in this video is not just a basketball breakdown. This is a story about frustration, ego, trust, and the brutal reality of what happens when a superstar with sky-high expectations finds himself surrounded by a situation that does not match the vision he had in his head. We are going to walk you through every single moment, the defensive breakdowns, the ignored play calls, the missed free throws, the secret messages, and the one possession that may have permanently changed the dynamic inside the Houston Rockets locker room. This is the Kevin Durant files, and by the time this video is done, you are going to look at the Rockets and at KD himself in a completely different way. So do not touch that screen, because we are just getting started.
Here is what makes this story so fascinating and so layered. On the surface, the Houston Rockets are supposed to be one of the most exciting young teams in the entire NBA right now. They have Alperen Şengün, a gifted, creative big man who makes plays that most centers in this league simply cannot make. They have Amen Thompson, an explosive, athletic wing who is developing into one of the more intriguing two-way players in the game. They have Jabari Smith Jr., a lengthy, skilled forward who was a top-3 pick not long ago. And then they went out and added Kevin Durant, a future Hall of Famer, a certified closer, a player who has been in more high-stakes moments than almost anyone alive. On paper, this roster makes sense. On paper, this should be a team quietly building towards something special. But what has been allegedly leaking out from behind the scenes tells a very different story. One filled with tension, miscommunication, and a superstar who is growing more and more uncomfortable with what he is seeing every single night. Now, before we go any further, if you are new to this channel, this is exactly the kind of content we live for. Deep, detailed, honest basketball storytelling that goes beyond the highlights and actually explains what is really happening inside these franchises. If that sounds like something you want more of, do yourself a favor right now and hit that subscribe button, because we do this consistently and we do it at a level you are not going to find many other places. And if you enjoy this video, drop a like. It genuinely helps this channel grow and tells us that you want more breakdowns exactly like this one. Now, with that said, let us set the full scene, because to truly understand where things went wrong, you need to understand how all of this started and why Kevin Durant arriving in Houston carried so much weight in the first place.
To understand the full weight of what has been unfolding inside the Houston Rockets organization, you have to go back and appreciate just how significant Kevin Durant's arrival in Houston actually was. The Rockets had been on a slow, steady rebuild for several years. After the James Harden era ended in chaos and trade requests and a messy departure, Houston committed to doing things the right way, drafting well, developing young talent, building a culture from the ground up. And it was working. Alperen Şengün emerged as a legitimate star, a player with real all-star caliber talent who could score, pass, and create in ways that made him one of the more unique offensive weapons in the entire Western Conference. Amen Thompson was growing. Jabari Smith Jr. was finding his footing. The Rockets were becoming genuinely competitive, and the basketball world was starting to pay attention. So when the opportunity came to add Kevin Durant, not a washed version of KD, but a fully healthy, fully motivated, supremely gifted Kevin Durant, the organization did not hesitate. This was supposed to be the moment where Houston stopped being a team with potential and started being a team with real championship aspirations. The expectations that came with Durant's arrival were enormous, and they were enormous for a reason. When you add a player of Kevin Durant's caliber to a young, athletic, defensively capable roster, the natural assumption is that everything gets easier. The late-game situations that used to feel uncertain suddenly have an answer. The offensive droughts that used to derail momentum suddenly have a solution. The close games that used to feel like a coin flip suddenly tilt in your favor because you have arguably one of the most unguardable offensive players in NBA history standing on your sideline. Coaches around the league game plan for Kevin Durant differently than they game plan for almost anyone else. Defenses collapse, schemes shift, rotations change. His presence alone alters the geometry of every single possession. And that was precisely the point. Houston was not just adding a scorer, they were adding a force of nature who was supposed to make every single person around him better and every single close game feel more manageable. The problem, as we are about to find out, is that reality had a very different plan in mind. Every great story has a moment where the cracks first start to appear, and in this story, those cracks began showing up on the defensive end of the basketball court. Alperen Şengün is many things as a basketball player. He is creative, he is skilled, he is capable of making passes that leave you genuinely speechless, and he has a feel for the game that you simply cannot teach. But defense has always been the complicated part of his profile, and as the Rockets started navigating the grind of the regular season with Kevin Durant on the roster, that defensive vulnerability began to surface in ways that were becoming increasingly hard to ignore. On February 5th, the Houston Rockets were at home against the Charlotte Hornets, a game that on paper should have been entirely manageable. The Hornets are not a powerhouse. They are not a team loaded with unstoppable offensive weapons. But what they did on that particular night was methodical, calculated, and almost surgical in the way they exposed Şengün repeatedly and without mercy. From the very first possession of the game, Charlotte made it crystal clear that they had done their homework, and their homework told them exactly where to attack. They ran dribble handoffs at Şengün. They put him in pick-and-roll coverage repeatedly. They isolated their guards against him in the open floor, and time after time, possession after possession, Şengün found himself a step slow, a beat late, and a decision behind, and the Hornets made Houston pay every single time it happened. By the time Şengün came out for his first rest at the end of the first quarter, Charlotte had scored 7 of the first 9 Houston baskets allowed by going directly at him, either in pick and roll or in isolation. That is not a coincidence. That is not bad luck. That is a team identifying a weakness and exploiting it with the kind of precision that only happens when one player's defensive limitations are obvious enough to build an entire game plan around. And here is where things get particularly interesting from Kevin Durant's perspective, because KD is not just watching this happen from the bench with a detached, analytical eye. He is on the floor for some of these possessions. He is seeing in real time the way opposing offenses are treating Şengün like an open door, a guaranteed 2 points every time they decide to attack him. And while it is absolutely fair to point out that Durant himself is not always doing everything he can on the help side to compensate for those defensive breakdowns, the frustration that is clearly building inside him is rooted in something real. When you are a player who has competed at the absolute highest level for his entire career, when you have won championships and played in finals and been in moments that most players only dream about, watching the same defensive mistakes happen over and over again in situations that matter does something to you. It builds, it accumulates, and eventually, as we are about to see, it boils over in ways that no amount of diplomatic post-game interviews can completely hide. If the Hornets game was where the frustration began quietly building inside Kevin Durant, then the February 11th matchup against the Los Angeles Clippers was where everything came to a head in the most dramatic, most painful, most revealing way possible. This was the game that pulled back the curtain. This was the game that took all of that simmering tension, all of that accumulated frustration, all of those private concerns that KD had been carrying around inside him and put them directly under the brightest spotlight imaginable. And what made it even more significant was the fact that the Rockets had every opportunity to win this game. They were right there. They were in it. They had fought and clawed their way back into a position where victory was absolutely within reach. And the decisions made in the final 2 minutes of that contest are the kinds of decisions that players and coaches and entire franchises end up dissecting for months afterward. Head coach Ime Udoka had made the bold call to bench Şengün for a significant portion of the fourth quarter, and the results were immediate and undeniable. With Jalen Green and Amen Thompson operating alongside Kevin Durant, and with the defensive intensity ratcheting up to a level that the Clippers simply could not handle comfortably, Houston went on a mini run that had the entire building believing that this was their night. The ball was finding KD's hands, the stops were coming, the momentum had completely shifted, and for a few beautiful electric minutes, everything felt exactly the way it was supposed to feel when you have Kevin Durant on your team in a close game late in the fourth quarter. But then, Ime Udoka made the decision that set the entire chain of events into catastrophic motion. He put Alperen Şengün back into the game with just over 2 minutes remaining, and from that moment forward, the Rockets' grip on the game began to loosen in slow, agonizing, almost unwatchable fashion. Down 3, Houston's offensive possession resulted in the ball going to Şengün rather than Durant, and while Şengün's instincts drove him to call for a screen and create his own look, the shot was difficult and the possession was ultimately unproductive. Durant bailed them out with a remarkable game-tying 3 that reminded everyone in the building exactly why he was brought to Houston in the first place. But the brief exhale of relief that followed was almost immediately replaced by more tension, because down 2 on the very next crucial possession, the Rockets ran an inverted pick and roll with KD acting as the screener for Şengün, and while Şengün found himself with a genuinely wide-open three-point look, he could not convert, surrendering the offensive rebound before watching Josh Collins race to the other end and convert an uncontested dunk that pushed the Clippers' lead right back up to 4. The entire sequence was maddening in the way only basketball can be maddening, a series of small, compounding failures that individually might be forgivable, but collectively paint a picture of a team that is not yet built to trust itself when everything is on the line. And Kevin Durant, standing on that court, watching it all unfold in front of him, was absorbing every single moment of it with an expression that told you everything you needed to know about what was happening inside his head.
Now here is where the story moves from compelling to absolutely fascinating. Because what happened in that timeout huddle, with the Rockets down 1 and needing a stop and a score to survive, is the moment that allegedly triggered Kevin Durant's now infamous burner account messages. Think about everything that had already happened in this game up to this point. Think about the defensive breakdowns from the Hornets game still fresh in KD's memory. Think about Şengün being benched for the fourth quarter, only to be reinserted at the most critical moment. Think about the wide-open 3 that did not fall. Think about the offensive rebound that slipped away and turned directly into a Clippers dunk at the other end. Think about Durant himself stepping up and hitting the game-tying 3, doing exactly what a franchise cornerstone is supposed to do in the biggest moment, only to watch the lead evaporate again almost immediately. All of that context is sitting on Kevin Durant's shoulders as Ime Udoka gathers the team in that huddle and begins drawing up the play that will determine whether the Rockets live to fight another possession or go home with a devastating loss. And, according to what has allegedly leaked from KD's private messages, what Udoka drew up in that huddle was a pick-and-roll action designed specifically to get the ball into Alperen Şengün's hands in a position where he would be the one making the decisive play. Durant, by his own alleged account, looked at that play call and felt something close to disbelief, because after everything that had already happened, after every missed shot and every defensive breakdown, and every moment where the ball not being in his hands had cost the Rockets dearly, his coach was now designing the most important possession of the entire night around the one player whose limitations had been the central source of tension all season long. What makes this hidden layer of the story so rich and so revealing is the visual evidence that appears to support exactly what Durant allegedly described in those private messages. When you watch the footage of that timeout huddle carefully, and we mean really carefully, paying attention not just to the whiteboard, but to the body language of every single person in that circle, you can see the moment when Udoka appears to gesture toward KD and indicate that the play ends with a pass to the right, which in this context means a pass to Şengün. And the reaction on Durant's face in that precise moment is one of the most unintentionally honest things you will ever see from a professional athlete in a team setting. It is not rage, it is not a dramatic outburst, it is something quieter and in many ways more telling than either of those things would be. It is the face of a man who has already mentally processed his disagreement, already decided that he is going to voice it, and is simultaneously preparing himself for the reality that the decision has already been made and he is going to have to live with it regardless of how he feels. Udoka apparently explains his reasoning. Durant apparently nods along, but the expression never really changes, and that expression is telling a story that no amount of post-game diplomatic language could ever fully contradict. This was a player who did not believe in the play being called, did not trust the outcome it was designed to produce, and was walking back onto that court carrying the full weight of that doubt on his shoulders, alongside every other frustration that had been quietly stacking up for weeks.
There are moments in sports that feel almost too painful to watch in real time, moments where everything that has been building beneath the surface finally erupts into something unavoidable and undeniable, something that no highlight reel or post-game press conference can soften or reframe or explain away. The final possession of that Rockets and Clippers game was one of those moments. Down one, with the season's emotional stakes riding on every dribble, Durant and Şengün ran exactly the pick and roll that Udoka had drawn up in that huddle, and to his credit, the execution was not wrong. Durant made the pass, Şengün caught it in the pocket, drove hard to the rim with genuine aggression and physicality, and was rewarded with contact and a trip to the free throw line. On paper, that is actually a successful play. The design worked. The action generated the right outcome. A trip to the free throw line, down one, with 2 shots to take the lead, that is a position any team in the NBA would accept in a pressure situation. But this is precisely where all of those weeks of quietly accumulated frustration, all of those mental notes KD had been taking about Şengün's 69% free throw shooting, all of those December memories of watching him stand at the line against the Clippers and fail to ice a game that should have been sealed, all of it came crashing back into the present moment with brutal, unforgiving clarity. Because Alperen Şengün stood at that free throw line in that silent arena with everything on the line, and he missed. He made the first one, cutting the deficit to nothing and tying the game momentarily in terms of what a second make would mean, and then the second free throw rimmed out, 1 for 2. The Clippers had life, and Kevin Durant, standing near the paint watching it happen, had just witnessed the single moment that his alleged private messages suggest he had been quietly dreading for weeks. What followed was the kind of ending that burns itself into a franchise's collective memory in the worst possible way. The Clippers, now with possession and a 1-point lead and all of the momentum that comes from watching your opponent's most critical free throw clang off the rim, went straight to their best player without a single moment of hesitation or doubt. Kawhi Leonard, calm, composed, ruthlessly efficient in the way only the very best players in the world can be in the very biggest moments, caught the ball on the elbow, rose up over a closing defender, hit the mid-range jumper, and drew the foul on top of it. And then he made the free throw. And just like that, a game the Rockets had every reason and every opportunity to win was gone. Not because they were outclassed, not because the opponents simply had more talent on the floor, but because in the single most important moment of the entire contest, the ball was in the hands of the one player whose ability to deliver in exactly that kind of scenario had been a legitimate, documented, statistically supported concern for the entire duration of the season. The Rockets had one final desperation heave that never had a realistic chance of going in, and then it was over. And somewhere in the aftermath of that loss, Kevin Durant reportedly went to his phone and said exactly what he had been thinking, not for public consumption, not with any filter or diplomatic softening, but with the kind of raw, unvarnished honesty that only comes out when someone believes they are speaking in private and the walls feel safe enough to finally tell the truth. Now that we have walked through every single moment of this story in full detail, it is time to step back from the emotion of it all and ask the question that actually matters most. Was Kevin Durant wrong? Because it is very easy to look at a superstar allegedly venting about his teammates on a burner account and immediately frame the entire narrative around his ego, his impatience, his inability to trust the process and the people around him. That framing is simple, it is clean, and it fits neatly into the pre-existing story that the basketball world already loves to tell about Kevin Durant whenever controversy finds him. But simple and clean are not the same thing as accurate, and when you actually sit down and look at the evidence, the game tape, the statistics, the specific situations and possessions and moments that apparently drove KD to the breaking point, the picture that emerges is considerably more complicated and considerably more sympathetic to his perspective than the easy narrative would have you believe. Alperen Şengün shooting 69% from the free throw line is not an opinion or an exaggeration, it is a fact, and it is a fact that carries enormous weight in close games where every single point is precious. Getting beaten defensively 7 times in the first 9 opposing possessions of a game against the Charlotte Hornets is not bad luck or an anomaly, it is a pattern, and patterns in professional basketball do not fix themselves without intentional, sustained, disciplined work. Kevin Durant did not invent these problems, he identified them. And identifying a real problem, even if the method of expressing that identification was imperfect, is not the same thing as being wrong. But here is where the analysis has to be genuinely honest rather than simply taking one side and running with it, because the full truth of what is happening in Houston is more nuanced than either a complete defense of KD or a complete condemnation of him. Durant is not without fault in this situation, and the game tape makes that clear as well. There are possessions in that Hornets game where Şengün is doing his job, guarding the ball handler, staying attached, executing his assignment, and the defensive breakdown happens because no other Rocket rotates to help, including Durant himself. There are moments in that Clippers game where KD's frustration appears to affect his own decision-making, where the emotional weight of disagreeing with the play call seems to bleed into the execution of it. And perhaps most importantly, the fundamental question of whether Kevin Durant's presence in Houston has actually made this team better in the ways everyone assumed it would is one that does not yet have a clean, definitive answer. Adding a superstar to a young team is not a mathematical equation where the outcome is guaranteed. It's a human process, full of adjustment and friction and growing pains that cannot be shortcut regardless of how much talent is involved. The Rockets are learning that lesson in real time, in the most public and uncomfortable way imaginable, and the question of how they respond to it, as a coaching staff, as a front office, as individual players, and yes, as Kevin Durant himself, will determine everything about what this franchise becomes in the years ahead. When a story like this one breaks into the public consciousness, the immediate aftermath is almost always a masterclass in the art of professional damage control, and the Houston Rockets were no exception to that rule. The press conferences came, the carefully worded statements followed, the practiced, diplomatic, emotional, neutral answers were delivered with the kind of polished composure that every professional athlete develops after years of navigating the relentless scrutiny of the media cycle. And right at the center of it all stood Kevin Durant himself, doing what superstars of his experience level always do when the walls start closing in, performing normalcy with such convincing commitment that a casual observer might genuinely wonder whether the entire story was exaggerated or misunderstood or taken out of context. The most telling example of this damage control came when Durant was asked about Alperen Şengün directly during the All-Star break in front of cameras and microphones and the full assembled weight of the basketball media. And what came out of his mouth was so carefully constructed, so precisely calibrated to say everything and nothing at the same time, that it almost demanded to be decoded rather than simply taken at face value. He described Şengün as still being in the process of fully settling into his game. He called it a beautiful problem to have for a two-time All-Star. He smiled, he nodded, he said all of the right things in all of the right ways. And yet every single word of that answer, when placed alongside the raw, unfiltered frustration allegedly contained in his private messages, read less than a genuine endorsement and more like a man reciting lines from a script he had written specifically to survive the next 24 hours without making the situation worse. The broader fallout from this story, however, extends beyond the immediate media circus of press conferences and carefully managed public appearances. Inside the Rockets organization, the alleged leak of Kevin Durant's private messages has created a layer of tension and uncertainty that does not simply dissolve because everyone shows up to practice the next morning and goes through the motions of professionalism. Trust, once questioned, does not rebuild itself overnight, and the specific nature of what was allegedly said, the pointed criticism of teammates by name, the frustration directed at coaching decisions, the raw, unfiltered expression of doubt about the people he is supposed to be building something with, all of it has a way of lingering in the atmosphere of a locker room long after the news cycle has moved on to the next story. Alperen Şengün now knows, or at least has every reason to believe, that the superstar his franchise brought in specifically to elevate the team has privately expressed serious reservations about his defense, his free throw shooting, his decision-making in crunch time, and his overall reliability in the moments that matter most. That is an extraordinarily complicated piece of information to carry around inside a professional environment where you are expected to play alongside that same superstar every single night with full trust and full commitment. The fans have reacted with the predictable mixture of outrage, amusement, fascination, and tribal loyalty that always accompanies a story of this nature. Some defending Durant as simply a competitor who demands excellence, others condemning him as a disruptive, ego-driven veteran who is poisoning a young team's culture from the inside. But the fan reaction ultimately reveals, more than any specific opinion or take, that the Houston Rockets' most pressing problem right now is not tactical or strategic,